Xi Jinping firmly believes that America is in decline.
Right.
He believes it. They watch the chaos. They watch riots in America. I mean, they watch American domestic politics. You should know they are fomenting this here at home, too.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. This week, we're talking about all the trouble in the world, and in particular, the greatest source of it, the Chinese Communist Party. Even in the midst of war in Europe and inflation and the border crisis here at home, there's no topic more important to America's national interest these days than China. And no one better to hear from than former CIA Director and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. After talking to Secretary Pompeo, I'll wrap up today's show with Heritage's own Brent Sadler, whose final assignment with the Navy was with the China branch at the Pentagon. The Heritage Foundation has been raising alarms about the misdeeds of the Chinese Communist Party for decades, from its threats against our allies and militaristic posturing, to intellectual property theft, forced abortions, and ethnic cleansing. The CCP's threat to each American's safety and prosperity increases by the day. Is it finally time for the United States to do something about it? And if so, how? And with whom? If this is your first time watching The Kevin Roberts Show, welcome. For those of you returning, I'm grateful you've subscribed. Each week, we're diving into issues that matter to you with voices from across the conservative movement. And we're also equipping freedom lovers across the country with the tools you need to go on offense against the left. Since Russia launched its war against Ukraine, we've all witnessed the best and worst mankind has to offer. From President Zelensky's courage to Ukrainian soldiers' defense of their homeland, to the Ukrainian people's resolve not to yield to tyranny and terror, we're watching world historical heroism play out in real time. Ukraine deserves all Americans' respect, our prayers, and not least, as much military and economic assistance as we can get them. Vladimir Putin has shown his true colors too. He's a thug, a tyrant, and like all organized crime bosses, not as smart as he thinks he is. He and his corrupt regime deserve the world's scorn. But, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, not the United States' undivided attention. The Putin regime may be an enemy, but his husk of the former Soviet Union is not really a rival. His fantasy of resurrecting a Russian empire is just that. Some speculate that his goal is to regain the global relevance that disappeared with the Soviet Union. But in truth, Russia can't start a new Cold War because China already did. And that conflict is not one the United States may or may not get drawn into. We're already in it, whether we like it or not, and our only choices are to join the fight or lose. I want to be really clear, both with Europe and with China, and as we'll discuss, Taiwan, it is not in the interest of the United States to send troops abroad. We've done that, and the threat has to be very real for that to happen. What you're going to hear is that the United States can take steps now to avoid that eventuality. But the key point is, too, China today is a more dangerous adversary than the Soviets ever were. The Chinese Communist Party enjoys strategic advantages Moscow never did, with greater capacity to project power around the world. The promised benefits from the United States' engagement with China haven't materialized. The allure of Chinese profits has cost too many American workers their jobs and too many American corporate leaders their souls. The CCP is not a partner, it's an enemy, and the greatest threat to freedom, self-governance, and the American Republic today. Saying so is not an escalation or a provocation, but a realization of America's position in the world today. That's why we're so fortunate to have former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo with us today. There's no one better to talk about China, its ambitions, and how the United States can lead the West to another victory against communist totalitarianism in the 21st century. We're going to jump to my conversation with him from Heritage's B.C. Lee Lecture. But before we do so, please remember to subscribe to The Kevin Roberts Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to give the show a 5-star rating while you're at it. Your ratings and reviews help us reach even more people with solutions for the biggest issues facing America. Stay with us. I'll be right back with Mike Pompeo.
Big tech is out of control. If they can silence the sitting president, what can they do to you? The Heritage Foundation has been on the front lines, fighting for free speech. We spotlight big tech censorship, demand reform, and help you fight for your rights. Heritage was the first conservative organization to reject big tech's money because this is too important. We won't be silenced.
I want to start with a broad question, even though I know we're going to talk into some detail about the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan, the situation in Ukraine. The broad question is about America and what I and my colleagues here at Heritage see as a lack of leadership. I say that respectfully toward the president and in his office and as a man, but it seems as if for the first time in my lifetime, and I'm a really young guy, but for the first time in my lifetime, that America's reactive, that we're waiting for other countries to take the lead. In fact, President Biden has gotten really close to saying that explicitly. Is that a fair assessment, A? And then B, what do we do to change it?
I try to avoid politics when I'm at this stuff. And, as someone who was elected in 2010 as a part of the big Tea Party class, that's hard. But it's important. Mm-hmm. But I think observationally it is accurate. I think observationally you can see that we were on our back foot. We'd seen this coming for months and didn't do what has been America's traditional role, is to get everyone, the like-minded nations together, those of us who believe the basic things about human dignity, the basic things about sovereignty, the basic ideas of religious freedom, and say we're all going to go mount the campaign to protect these people who are prepared to do this. And so not only were we reactive to Vladimir Putin, that is, I think he has successfully, so far, been able to drive the timelines and the storyline. That may be about to end, but so far I think that's true. And then President Biden has somehow suggested that he wants to be behind some other countries in acting. Mm-hmm. That's a mistake, in my view. I mean this with no arrogance. Mm-hmm. The world counts on the United States. There's no other nation of size and scale, and in my judgment as well, with the moral capacity to lead on matters just like we're seeing confronting in the Russia-Ukrainian fights today. We ought to be doing that. Your question about how to do it, I'm heartened. I've actually seen Congress push the president, frankly, on a pretty bipartisan basis in many cases, to do more. I applauded the president today, the announcement of $800 million. I wish we'd had that to the Ukrainians in December or January, but we're here. And so the things we can do is be clear about what matters, be clear about what America's interests are, because that is important for American political leadership, and then make the case to the world about why this is such an important challenge.
Well, thanks for that response. So pivoting from that, although it's very related, and it is the United States' view toward Taiwan, I want to pick up on an offer you made in the middle of your speech, which is with me to explain that day 994 out of your 1,000 days. What changed regarding your decision on that day, and what has changed since then?
Yeah, nothing changed. I had formed my judgment. I'd be very careful. I'll get State Department lawyers riled up. I had formed my judgment early on, but pushing this through the State Department bureaucracy was a nightmare, a complete nightmare.
That comes as a shock to us at the Heritage Foundation, by the way.
Look, I think that memo came up originally. You wouldn't know, this is arcane, but everybody and their brother gets to give me their judgment on the memo to human rights, but everybody.
That didn't happen in the machine shop?
I wanted to know what my engineers thought.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I'll stop interrupting.
Plane had to fly. And I think it was 2 to 43 or something like that. And I wanted it to last. Mm-hmm. And so the 2 to 43 was unsurprising, but I wanted to go work the process a little bit and try and explain to people why. So I brought groups up. I brought them up in groups of 6 or 8 and say, here's what I'm thinking. Tell me why you're thinking what you're thinking, so that it would post-date me. So I had the power to make the decision at that moment, but I spent 9 or 10 months just working to try and get that memo to come up with a few more supportive voices on it. I was pretty unsuccessful at that. The administration has mostly kept the policy. They've pulled it back in practice in some degree, mm-hmm. but the rules haven't changed, and that's a good thing. We ought to be willing to meet with them on State Department property and take a picture.
One would
Seems
think.
so basic.
One would think.
Yes.
So dialing out a little more broadly and thinking about Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, you did touch on very forcefully, very, very articulately, the conclusions that both of them have drawn about America right now. And again, like you, I have no desire to pick on the President of the United States. We're just calling a spade a spade. We're a policy shop. But what optimism, I guess, can you give this audience, whether they're in person or online, that in spite of what we all know to be true, which is that those two leaders in particular have drawn a conclusion about American power, which is not ideal, that maybe there is, as you and I were talking backstage, the beginning of something to change there, that Americans can say, oh, okay, we're not necessarily going to intervene all over the world, but we're at least going to be a little more forceful than we've been in the first year of President Biden's presidency.
Yeah, there's two pieces to this. One is the one you described, which is their perception that we won't use American power in important ways in a timely fashion. The second one is the bigger challenge, which is that Xi Jinping firmly believes that America is in decline.
Right.
He believes it. I think Putin believed that in elements the United States was in decline as well. They watch the chaos. They watch riots in America. I mean, they watch American domestic politics. You should know they are fomenting this here at home too. We haven't talked about. I didn't speak about today. They're inside the gates. China's working the room, not very far from where you all are sitting right now. They have an enormous united front operation in every significant country in the world, including right here in Washington, D.C. And so not only do they believe we're in decline, they are trying to make sure that they're right about their core belief. So what do you do? In the end, this is about leaders stepping up and making the case to the American people about why these things matter. Mm-hmm. I would always tell my European counterparts who, they were pretty exhausted from us telling them they needed to pay 2% of their GDP for defense. And I would tell them in private, most of them were elected officials, unlike the Secretary of State. Most of my counterparts were members of parliament, right, in parliamentary systems in Europe. I would tell them, go to your home district. Explain why it mattered. Well, it's very hard for us to spend money on defense. I'm like, yeah, you think the people of Kansas just think, right? We had to go make the case for why this mattered. This is the kind of thing Americans can lead on. I offered to every one of them to go to their home district and stand alongside them on a podium in their home district and make the case for European expenditures for security for the world. I received exactly 0 acceptances. But this is what America has to do as well. We have to make the case not to send 20, 50, 100,000 American soldiers, right, but that says the tools that we have, American energy, every significant Western country in the world wants to be a technology partner with the United States, right? They want to work alongside great companies like Samsung and TSMC, right? Countries with the rule of law and property rights and contracts, all the basics. We've got to go make the case to the American people why this matters. Then we can stand with our colleagues around the world and make the case to their people as well. And when we do that, Xi and Putin will end up being wrong. I'm convinced of that. You talked about optimism. I'm long America. We're gonna pull through this thing. We always do. There's no reason to believe that, but only when leaders are prepared to explain why these things actually matter and why someone who's sitting in New Mexico or New Hampshire or Nevada should give a darn about what's going on in Ukraine. We know that these things matter. I think they can see it more clearly today than they could even 6 or 8, 10 weeks ago. That's failed American leadership from 6 or 8 or 10 weeks ago.
That's exactly right, and I'm glad to hear you say or explain foreign policy on what I like to call the sidewalk level. And we've lamented here at Heritage for the last few weeks that we seem to be in this period of American political history when foreign policy has become so partisan. I mean, I know when I was cutting my teeth in politics, the same would have been true for you based on previous conversations we've had, that it was neither a Democrat nor a Republican approach to foreign policy. It was one that put America first. We would quibble over some of the little differences, but hopefully what we're seeing is a real change there. The exception to that, though, seems to be the reality that as you and I and the audience sit here right now, the Biden administration is negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. What in the world do we do about that?
Yeah, I often get asked, can you explain, someone who has a different view, can you explain their logic?
I'm trying.
And I can usually make the case, and we simply have different priorities or different, we value something different. This one is beyond my ken. Mm-hmm. I cannot explain, if you believe the core premise, which is that we have a great security partner in the state of Israel, with enormously deep economic ties, who we should want to be friends with, the lone democracy in the Middle East. Right. If you accept that the largest state sponsor terror in the world are the Iranians, and they are determined to build a nuclear weapon, and if they do, there's no reason to think that there won't be a half a dozen other Gulf states that think that, boy, that'd be, if they have one, I want one too. If you accept those three facts, it is unexplainable that you would, I understand today, the United Kingdom, they got one of their own back, someone who'd been held hostage. I prayed for her. We worked to get her home. But they gave $500 million to the Iranian regime to do that, if I have the facts right. That $500 million will kill someone in the West. You can write it down. I couldn't tell you if it's in Iraq, an American soldier. I couldn't tell you if it is a British soldier working someplace in Syria. I couldn't pick it. I couldn't tell you if it'd be some civilian sitting in Denver, Colorado. I don't know where that money will flow precisely, only that it will be used for malign activity. And we ought not reward hostage taking, and we ought not be sitting at the table with, think about what this table looks like today. This table looks like, we're not in the room, but just this is an imaginary table. There is an Iranian on that side, and the Russian on this side, and the Chinese guy on that side. I got nothing. I literally, you can't articulate an outcome there that is in the best interest of the United States of America. I understand there's some chance they're going to force them to take this 60% enriched uranium and ship it off to Russia. I mean, okay. It's unexplainable to me to think that that's a solution that's going to prevent the Iranians from, in the crunch moment, when you're trying to figure out who's who and who has friends, think about who the Iranians will turn to. There's only really 3 places they could turn. They could turn to the North Koreans. They've done that before in a nuclear file. They could turn to the Chinese Communist Party. They could turn to the Russians. And we're going to deliver highly enriched uranium, take it out of Iran, move it to Russia, and call it good. This is very dangerous. It will force, unfortunately, it will force Prime Minister Bennett into a very, very difficult decision-making process, not knowing whether his friend and partner, the United States, will actually help him make sure that he doesn't have to live with what Israel can't, which is a nuclear-armed Iran.
It's hard to believe, and I really appreciate your candor. I'll just sort of riff off your metaphor about a table. And let's say that we've got a table that represents South America and another table that represents Africa. In the last few months, Heritage has hosted 2 heads of state, one from South America, Latin America, one from Africa. And one of the themes, among others, that each of those gentlemen brought to Heritage was America is not helping with the China threat in these continents. Give us a sense, based on your expertise. I'm not necessarily looking for optimism as much as reality, knowing that maybe by just calling a spade, you do that, Heritage does that, experts in the room, many in the diplomatic corps understand this, that we can get to a point where we're confronting the threat from the Chinese Communist Party in those 2 continents. Yeah.
I'm unsurprised that you heard that from them. We saw this during our time in office. Every single one of my ambassadors knew that they had 3 priorities. The first priority was the United States of America. The second priority was the country to which they were credentialed. And the third one was making sure we knew every single move that their counterparts, the Chinese diplomatic team in their particular country, was undertaking, both their diplomatic efforts and their economic efforts. You can go ask any of them, foreign service officers, politicals, they all knew that the thing we were looking for when they sent back cables was, tell me what the Chinese Communist Party is up to in your country. So the first rule is always, just like any other thing, it's a 12-step program. I have a problem. So we made sure they knew we had a problem, they were working it. There are so many more things that we could do to help them. It's usually economic. We're not going to go toe-to-toe with them, but I'll give you just one example, and this is a good bipartisan example. The Chinese were about to take over what was the old Subic Bay in the Philippines, but the deal wasn't done when I became Secretary of State, and I said, we're going to go put a marker down. We're going to go crush that deal. Day before yesterday, a private equity firm here in the United States closed on the old Subic Bay. It was a bunch of South Korean debt. We had to renegotiate. It was very complicated. Department of Defense had to step up and do some work. But it's pretty remarkable. That port, and important, if you just stare at the map and stare at the historic laydown of Subic Bay, and the port's a little different today, but if you stare at the laydown, that geostrategic footprint, to have the Chinese Communist Party owning that asset would have been really, really dangerous to Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Singapore, Sri Lanka, each of those countries that we all know are under coercive threat. So we now have an American private equity firm. God bless them for stepping up and doing it. Hope they make a lot of money.
That's what winning looks like. Congratulations, Mr. Secretary.
But I meant that in a good sense, right?
Yeah,
we didn't get it closed out on our watch.
Yep.
This administration came in, and the ambassador there and the ambassador in another country that was working really hard on this made it all happen.
Secretary Mike Pompeo, thanks for your service. Thanks for being with us.
50 years ago, the Heritage Foundation was created to help conservatives save America from crime, inflation, communist aggression, and cultural decay brought on by left-wing coastal elites. The bad news is, leftists are screwing it up all over again. This means we're going to have to save America once more. And the good news is, we can. Today, heritage is the tip of the spear for America's counteroffensive against the woke socialist left dominating Washington and poisoning our country. We're laying out the facts, leading the debates, and setting the agenda to protect our elections and our border, to rein in big tech and rescue kids from woke schools, and to help Americans rebuild a strong economy and even stronger families. After what we've seen the woke left become in recent years, we know the days of reacting to them are over. From Congress to school boards to kitchen tables, conservatives need to go on offense every day, stay on offense, and win the fight for the next generation. Welcome back, everyone, for our final segment of the show. Joining me to talk more about the growing threat of the Chinese Communist Party and how America should position itself to confront it is our very own Brent Sadler. Brent is a Navy veteran who served for more than 25 years in everything from operational tours on nuclear-powered submarines to working as a military diplomat in Asia. He now serves as Senior Fellow for Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology at the Heritage Foundation's Center for National Defense. Brent, thanks for being here.
It's great to work with you. Thank you very much for having me. Oh, absolutely.
You've been a busy guy. I mean, as our guests, our audience now know, you've been a busy guy for a long time on behalf of American freedom, so thank you. But you in particular have been a busy guy the last few weeks because of everything that's going on in the world, especially in what I imagine is your favorite region of the world, and that's the Far East. So before we get into some specific questions about some of the details, one of the questions I like to ask our expert guests is give us sort of the kitchen table answer for people who are tuning in, knowing that Heritage can give them some sense of being able to converse about the topic. What do we need to know about the threat from China and about America's position there?
Oh, absolutely. So the short answer is that this is an all hands, all nations challenge, and it does affect us. You may not feel it or recognize it, but the movies you watch, the newspapers and the websites that you go to, social media, they're all influenced by it. And the first thing, kind of like the Matrix, is kind of waking up to the reality that you're in. That's the first thing, is to acknowledge that. And so it's very real, and it's all encompassing.
And it's interesting that a crisis in Eastern Europe has helped us to recognize, and I think across the political spectrum, that we see this huge threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And so what I want to do is sort of use that as a pivot point to talk about what I think has been largely a well-intentioned experiment in American foreign policy. You know that, of course, you can always disagree with me, so tell me if I'm mistaken, but that experiment was in the early 70s, President Nixon trying to triangulate Beijing because we were focused on Moscow with good reason. And presidential administrations, Democrat and Republican alike, sort of continued that. I can say that I certainly thought that the American free market, American virtue would help China become more like America, and all we've seen is that China's become more like China.
Absolutely. So in the early 70s, really starts in the late 60s, for very realist reasons, in the height of the Cold, at a very dark part of the Cold War, it made total sense to try to play the Communist Chinese against the Soviets in Moscow. It was an unnatural, I think, Secretary Dulles got it right in the 50s, that you just let them get close, they'll actually realize they hate each other. So that's still true to this today. And the reality is by the 70s, the end of the 70s, the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party, was bankrupt, and they needed a helping hand. So it worked out for us, and them in the end, to shift over and open up our economy to them. But we didn't really have a clear idea. We mirrored too much our own preconceptions and notions that if they saw the benefits of a prosperous Western way, that they too would join. The reality is it was always about Chinese Communist Party's power and legitimacy, and they would never allow that change. And so hope is not really a good recipe for success. And unfortunately, for too long, that's what we were banking on.
Do you think, just as a quick follow-up question before we get to the threat in terms of details that China poses to America, do you think that someone who's watching this, whether they're left of center, right of center, in the center, that it's right for us to say, it's okay for you to have thought that. We're not casting stones. We sort of all believe that to some extent or another, but what we have to recognize is now is the moment we have to move on from that, whether we're liberals or conservatives.
No, absolutely. It was very healthy, and I thought it was very welcome the response from Secretary Pompeo the other day when he said exactly that. He's like, we can't, nor should we focus in on casting stones at what someone felt or the opinions that they wrote about 2 or 3 years ago or 10 years ago. The consensus was, and up until about the mid-2000s, that China was going to eventually join fully and become I think the word of the day was responsible stakeholder. Most people now, with very few exceptions, have come to that realization that we have to embrace the Chinese Communist Party as it is and have a much more realistic approach of what we can do and where we can actually partner with them on, which is very limited, and also at the same time much more aggressively compete with them effectively.
And I think both of those are really important. I mean, after all, America is a republic, so we do want to develop partnerships where we can. It's part of our, thank God, our DNA as a people. But what I want to home in on is sort of lead with the bad news, and that is the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to America. I think one of the things that we lament at Heritage, and this would have to be true for you and your colleagues in foreign policy who are real experts, is that there's a lot of rhetoric about the threat that the CCP poses. But what Heritage and other policy folks can offer is a detailed understanding of what those threats are. So in a nutshell for our audience, what would the list look like?
So it's about 4 different things, main categories. It's comprehensive. It's a comprehensive competition. The Chinese have thousands of years of strategic culture that you need to go to study on. I'm not going to go into all that, obviously. But so the first is diplomatic and political. So they do play our politics in it. They do play diplomatically in multilateral fora like UN, ASEAN, in all kinds of nefarious ways. So that's one. And that's been a real heated competition for 20 years plus, actually. Then there's the economic, which there's lots of writing, lots of awareness of that, failed promises of the WTO, joining or welcoming of China, et cetera. Then there is the military, which is very easy to quantify as well as to qualify based on the insights that we have on that. But then I would leave with probably the most sinister and insidious, and kind of I hinted at earlier, and that is the societal. That's another avenue that they're challenging us in with using our own media, using our own laws against us.
Yeah, I mean, we often hear, and you've mentioned it in some other appearances, that the Chinese are using American freedom, the American free market, to exploit us. I do, given your experience as a veteran, want to home in on the military capabilities, because one of the things we're trying to achieve here at Heritage all the time, but especially this year, is to be specific about the threats. Not to be alarmist, that's not what we're up to, but to be realistic so that we can guide policymakers in the United States toward a responsible policy that addresses the threat. And I know the people that I talk to a lot are really concerned about the Chinese military. Are they mistaken?
No. And the analogy that I use, it's a kind of a, if you pardon the sailor's analogies, if you realize you're going to have a collision 5 miles out, you can throw the rudder over like 2 degrees and make slow down by just a knot. Make a little change, and you'll avoid the collision by a wide margin. But if you wait, you're going to have to throw the rudder over more aggressively and change your speed. And if you get to just the moment before the collision, you're throwing your engines all back emergency, which is like taking your car from 60 miles ahead to reverse and slam it on the gas and try and go backwards while you're going forwards. So we're approaching that point, but we're not at imminent collision if we take appropriate action to meet the Chinese military threat.
Right, and so probably people in the audience are detecting, even from Heritage, that we're continuing to say what we've always said in terms of detail, but we have clicked up a notch or two the rhetoric, but rhetoric that is substantiated by real evidence, and that is, to use your wonderful sailor's analogy, that let's start changing course now so that, number one, there isn't a collision, but number two, we don't have to take such drastic measures that it really begins to affect American lives in the way, or our quality of life in the way that we would really see. Absolutely.
Better to do it early at lower cost and risk in human life and also capital. By all means.
So aggravating that, one of the things we do on this show is to tell all of the bad news, and then we'll conclude with some optimism. But aggravating that is the situation with Taiwan. And so also sort of a nutshell question, what is it that our audience needs to know about Taiwan itself, but also how the situation with the Taiwanese affects American-Chinese relations?
So I'll kind of walk around a little bit. First is the geography. Sure. Taiwan is a link in a chain, the first island chain, which really constrains what the Chinese, their military can do unopposed on a day-to-day basis. So you lose that link in the chain, our problems actually magnify and multiply. So that's the geographic one. Then there's the economic and supply chain part. There's lots of things that we get from Taiwan, but probably the most notable is microprocessors. And there's been efforts in the last during the Trump administration to address this more aggressively. And I think we may see some of that diminish as the companies in Taiwan like TSMC was mentioned by Secretary Pompeo as well, move to diversify their production chain. So there's that. Right. And it's more than just microchips. Mm-hmm. And then there is people. There are about 50,000 American citizens living in Taiwan. So if China does do what the Russians are doing in Kiev and Kharkiv and Mariupol, there's going to be American citizens that get killed, and that will be on our TV, and it will become a hot-button political item here very quickly when when the consequences of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan come home. Right,
and I'm presuming that isn't fiction. I mean, there's a real possibility that can happen.
Yes, I'm in that school of thought. When Secretary Pompeo acknowledged what some in this town are calling the Davidson window for Admiral Davidson, said that China's making every indication to be prepared for military confrontation with the United States over resolving Taiwan, which is an invasion or it's maybe a little less, but still violent and very bloody, before 2027. I'm in that school of thought.
Yeah, well, and I think if our audience has not come to know you yet, that by virtue of my recitation of your background and your comments today, they know to trust you, so thanks. But I want to ask you one final question, Brent, and it's a two-parter. The first is, what will it take for America to defeat the Chinese Communist Party? And secondly, because I know you're going to give me a straight answer, how optimistic are you that can happen?
So I'll start off with the last part. And so I'm very optimistic if we play all our cards.
Okay.
We tend to hold our punches or pull our punches, and we tend to not play all our cards in our hand when we should, when take that early action. So I'm confident that we're waking up to the reality, and more importantly, our partners and allies like Japan, who've been dealing with this reality longer than we have, and in Australia, there's a lot there to be told as well, that we have friends that are also helping us see the light. So I'm confident. It's definitely clear that it's a bipartisan. Thankfully, politics here won't get in the way, hopefully, of taking action. But it's going to come with a bill. We have to be prepared to pay more for defense than we have in the last 30 years. The peace dividend now needs to be taken out of the bank and put into investments in our military. And while I'm a Navy guy and I think it should be a lot of Navy, it's not just Navy. It's all of the above.
Yeah, well, an excellent analysis. I'd sit here and talk to you for a couple hours, but I need to let you get back to work. And I just want to conclude, Brent, by thanking you for your service to Heritage, service to this country, and look forward to working with you for many years.
Thank you very much, Dr.
You
Roberts.
bet. Well, that's going to wrap up things for this week's show. I want to thank again my guest, former CIA Director and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Heritage Senior Fellow Brent Sadler. Please remember to subscribe to The Kevin Roberts Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And give the show a 5-star rating while you're at it. And please be sure to tell a friend. Our movement is for everybody. All are welcome. And the way to ensure that our government lives by the same principles that we do is to make our movement bigger and give it an even louder voice. Take care, and I'll see you back here next week.